All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Acts chapter 17. I'm exploring verse 26. And the reason why I am exploring this verse is because this verse, which single handedly condemns racism, but ironically was used to justify slavery, justify segregation. Okay, so that, and I want to explore that because there are Christian denominations, and again, I think this is important we understand this. I deal a lot on Facebook, and believe it or not, I deal with Christian racists, believe it or not. But in order to understand that, we have to kind of go back in history. And I said I was going to kind of let this linger. We have to go back in history and ask the question, how does now, and I'm going to use their language because a lot of Trump supporters, a lot of Charlie Kirk, followers. Why did these two men? They're not the only ones, but they just they're out front. Why do Christians follow them? When at the passing of Kirk, all of a sudden you had Christians. Even now you have Christians, lionizing him in their churches. In their churches, sometimes you see the video of people saying, "You know what? I walked out because how they were lionizing Kirk." And what's interesting, of course, about this, we have to kind of go back because people now in today's time frame are trying to sanitize the history, but we still see the residue of the history. There are a lot of there are just a lot of Christians, white evangelical Christians today that still feel the same way. They don't feel an equality with an affinity and equality with black people. Now, the culture aspect, you have to say, well, why do they feel that way? Well, because today they have been trained that if you go back to the 50s and 60s and you saw how open the racism was, in the 70s, what was called Nixon's Southern Strategy taught them, take off your Klan sheets. Don't stop saying the N word, at least openly, but use code language. So for example, what they would say back then, to say forced busing, that was a code language. In other words, they're taking your white child and putting them in a black school, or they're going to flood your schools with black children. That's code. And it worked because you have people today that won't openly express their racism, but everything that again, Kirk was prime example. See, that's a prime example of that. When you have people right now that they come out so forcefully against Black Lives Matter, right? BML, DEI. And you have, again, our president erasing African American history. These are expressions. But let's kind of back up. Let's back up, though. How did we get here? So we go back to slavery. We go back to 1776 when the Constitution was written, enacted, Shouldn't the slaves have been freed then? But why weren't they? Why wasn't the slaves freed? Why did slavery persist past 1776? You have to understand, and then there were, and I'm just going to there were three things. There were three things. There were three areas that help condition Americans, which included but not limited to the Christian church, white Christians, that slavery was okay, that slavery was justified. Well, one was, of course, the Constitution itself that gave the permission for slavery. That through now extended passing laws, slave laws. It was legal to own slaves, despite, again, Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, writing, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men have been endowed with inalienable rights by their Creator." I probably didn't quote that exactly, but anyway, how can you write that and then have slaves? See, so there was a cognitive dissonance, right? There was a conditioning of the mind to be able to say, "Oh, except the Africans." But in order to strengthen that mindset, you had to then pass law. It was legal to own slaves. It was illegal for Africans to be free. Which brings me to my kind of the next point, because then you had to also they invented pseudoscience. So, for example, they made up science that black people were inferior, that black people genetically were fitted for slavery. There was even a disease called drapemania, and that was the disease that certain Africans had the urge to be free of their slavery. True, I kid you not. So they just made up science. By the way, just so you know, African Americans are dealing with this in the medical field now, where you got certain nurses and doctors that won't treat Africans today. Again, in 2025, you still have to deal with that. And then last, these are not the only things, but these are kind of the three that that kind of popped out to me. But and this is the one that kind of hits close to home to me, because I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. But the Christian church, the Christian church, the Christian church. Because now the Christian church, they would say things like, God, the curse of Ham. I don't know if you ever heard that, the curse of Ham, that one of Noah's sons, Ham, that God cursed him and then cursed him with dark skin, and also consigned him to be a slave, his seed to be a slave. But that's not the only thing. It's not the only thing. They said that, let's go to the scriptures here, because this is kind of where we are in our study. Okay, here we go. Verse 26. So let me read this here. From one man, he's made every nationality to live over the whole earth. He has determined their appointed times and boundaries where they should live. Now, there were Christians, again, just go back every denomination, every one of them doing slavery, wrestled with internally the issue of slavery. So within each denomination, there was some that says, y'all wrong. And then the other one says, no, 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 we're right. It's God's will for this to exist. Okay? It's God's will. Slavery could not in America could not exist without the Christian church. So then when we come over into Jim Crow segregation, the church was again right out front of it. So that you have very prominent institutions like Bob Jones University, Liberty University, right? Jerry Falwell, and many other Christian colleges and churches and denominations that would not allow blacks to fellowship. Okay, would not. And this is one of the verses right here. When it says right here, he has uh, determined, look at this last verse, right? He has determined the appointed times and boundaries where they should live. And many Christian churches use that to justify segregation. Now, I ask, if you're going to go by this verse of scripture, how is it that the Europeans went beyond the boundaries of Europe and then came over to America and colonized other nations? You just violated God's word according to your interpretation. That's the hypocrisy. So the very three things that I just talked about, the Constitution, laws, pseudoscience, things such as the medicine, but also science, and then Christianity, by those three, not only those three though, that America conditioned white people that slavery and then Jim Crow segregation was just. So you have to kind of now go back and say, now, let's say if Uncle Silas jumps in his carriage, he got his little daughter Becky right in there, and he's going up to his brother's plantation, right? Northford, okay. And as they're driving and they see all of the blacks working the field. And then Becky says, Daddy, why do those people have to work in the fields? So Daddy would condition little Becky and say, well, God so designed for the dark skins, the darkies, to be our servants because they were cursed with Ham, the curse of Ham. And so it's God's will for there to be black slaves, for the blacks to be slaved. It's God's will, right? The science said, and by the way, doctors also said that, that the blacks are inferior. If you don't think that's true, think about this. The first boxer, Jack Johnson, and this is where the term the Great White Hope came from. You start off with, again, the crazy notion that blacks are inferior to whites in every way. The mental aspect, psychological, right? Emotional, and then they also said physical. The whites were superior. And they held that belief coming through slavery, out of slavery, that Jack Johnson, the first black worldwide black boxer, I think around 1900, that he would just effortlessly just beat the crap out of these white boxers, to that they sought for a great white hope to beat this black man. That was the hope. The hope never materialized. Sort of like the MAGA hope, making America great again. It's a code word for making America white again. But I digress. I digress. That mentality presented to the fact that in the 40s or the 30s, late 30s, okay, the late 30s, Hitler uh, 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 came to one of the the Olympian Games to see the white superiority, and there was that Jesse Owens, that black man, effortlessly destroyed all of the white, and Hitler was furious. Now, why? Because they thought it was inferior. So this is, again, the idea here is white people were conditioned, and then the sad thing is the church. Y'all, Bob Jones and Jerry Falwell, even Billy Graham in the beginning of his crusades preached a segregated audience. At first, they wasn't allowing, and then, of course, if you're going to allow them in, you segregated them. So the question is, what gospel are you preaching if you got blacks on one side and whites on the other side? The shame of this. And then finally, Billy Graham finally said, "Oh, okay, we just can't do this." But the fact that it took you that long. Now, his son is not too far from that ideal. Again, so this mentality is still here. And that's why, by the way, that Trump and Kirk so incited that white pride in white Christians. That's why you see the surge in their support of these two men, because he speaks to the white pride. But doing, like, even the Bob Jones and all of them, see, they use this verse here that God has determined their appointed times and boundaries. Again, if that's true, then you violated that, because where did God tell you to come out of the boundaries of Europe? The Caucasian people. The Caucasian people, right? So it is a horrible thing that even still exists today. That sadly there are a lot of, when I see churches display their bold support of Charlie Kirk, and there are certain identifiers that you have that people, that their hatred for Black Lives Matter, right? Their hatred for DEI, and all of that is just based upon just lies, since white people benefit more from DEI than the black people themselves. Then you have to ask yourself the question, why do you hate the Black Lives Matter movement? I mean, there's so much, again, and all of this in the name of Christianity. In other words, Christians as a whole. Now, there were Christians who fought, but they're, against racism. They fought against slavery, against Jim Crow. But there were an awful lot that held on to their racism. It manifests differently today. Let me tell you how it does, because white churches will flee faster. They will flee faster than the white flight. Too many black people show up in their churches, their cities, they're out of there. No, we need to preach the gospel to these people. No. All right, guys, that's kind of a that verse 26 right there, how it was used to justify racism and segregation. And that we still deal with that today. When you see how boldly churches support Trump, that's an indicator right there. And that tells you right there. That tells you what's in their heart. And now with the, I don't know, it's maybe that Charlie Kirk is somewhat dying down the kind of phenomenon. But of course, when it's passing, how they put him up as a Christian martyr. I'm going to say he was a white Christian martyr, but a martyr for what? Even though it was one of his own, but the symbolism that they used, they didn't care about his racial rhetoric. They tried to sanitize it. But anyway, that's all right, guys. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I'll